Welcome to Decarceration Nation, a podcast about radically reimagining America's criminal justice system. You can find all previous episodes on our website, www.decarcerationnation.com. And if you like the podcast, please remember to hit like and to subscribe to the channel below. Chris Fabricant is the Innocence Project's Director of Strategic Litigation and one of the nation's leading experts on forensic sciences and the criminal justice system. A former public defender and clinical law professor, Fabricant has over 2 decades of experience ranging from litigating death penalty cases in the Deep South to misdemeanors in the South Bronx. Welcome to the Decarceration Nation podcast, Mr. Fabricant. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I always ask the same first question. How did you get from wherever you started in life to where you were the Director of Strategic Litigation at the Innocence Project?
Well, I think that you could really trace it all back to a drug bust in 1969 when my mother was indicted for trafficking in hash, and my father, who was a public defender in 1969, was assigned to her case. And
wow.
The product of that union was me, a very short-lived marriage, but ultimately, I think you can draw a straight line from that to, my work around the advocacy of reforming the criminal legal system has really been something that has been ingrained in me since as long as I can remember. And I always knew that I was going to be a public defender. And I was a public defender for many, many years. And like most people who've worked in the legal system in this country, after a while of representing individuals and, experiencing secondhand, but at least observing firsthand, the devastating impact of our carceral system in this country, that you want to try to do more systemic work to try to create broader change. And that's really what led me ultimately to the Innocence Project after spending a long time as a public defender.
Yeah, I think traditionally I tend to work on the other side of the pool, trying to help folks who probably were guilty at least of something. Could you talk a little bit about the Innocence Project for folks who might not be familiar with your work? I know most people probably are, but probably worth at least mentioning.
The Innocence Project really has 2 missions, and one is to free the incalculable number of people who have been wrongfully convicted, in this country. And if you think about how many people we have in various forms of incarceration in this country, 2.3 million at any given time. We think maybe even if only 1% of them have been wrongfully convicted, we're talking about tens of thousands of people. And the other, aspect of our work is to prevent future wrongful convictions, and so we work in both DNA and more recently, and this being our 30th anniversary, have begun to do a little bit more non-DNA exoneration work. And I write about a couple of the cases of our early cases in that work in my book. And, my role at the Innocence Project in particular is, as Director of Strategic Litigation, is what we do and the attorneys in my department do, is litigate around the leading contributing factors of wrongful conviction. And so, the number one, as far as DNA exonerations go, is eyewitness misidentification. And the second leading contributing factor, and this is the misapplication of forensic sciences. Nearly half of all wrongful convictions are attributable, at least in part, to the use of unreliable forensic evidence.
Before we get to that, something you just said interested me. I think most people aren't aware of the problems with unreliable testimony. We tend to think that if someone says that they saw something, that must be the case. But that has become pretty problematic, at least from a research perspective. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. We have a lawyer in strategic litigation named Anton Robinson. That's all he does is litigation around the use of eyewitness identification at trial. Because we know today, this is similar to forensics, that there are really cost-effective ways to ensure that lineup identification and other forms of eyewitness identification evidence is done in a way that is not suggestive, and that are actual tests of witnesses' memory rather than a test of the police or investigators' theory as to who was the actual perpetrator. Blinded lineup administration and, avoiding the use of show-ups and, a whole host of other reform efforts that go into, trying to prevent eyewitness misidentifications, which are, have been shown again and again and again to be, inherently unreliable, and especially so if they're done under suggestive circumstances.
These interviews tend to, we talk about pretty serious subjects and they tend to get a little heavy. So this season, I've tried to lighten it up a little bit at the beginning and ask people if they have any hobbies that people might not know about, just to get a little bit better feeling about the folks that I'm interviewing, as opposed to just the dark and depressing end of criminal justice work.
Yeah. My hobby is really writing, I mean, it's like, so the,
well, that worked out well for the book, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I've got 2 kids and, and we have a busy life here in Brooklyn. So that plus writing, plus working at the Innocence Project really takes up almost all of my time. Also a runner, I guess you could throw that.
Oh, there you go.
There, right. But absent that, I don't really have time for other hobbies. Then I read a lot, I don't know, I guess a little bit of this and that, but, primarily I write, I litigate, I go to bed.
How much time do you have to run? How far do you go?
Well, I run, typically I go like a 6 to 8 miler every weekend, and then try to get in another 1 or 2 during the course of the week. It really depends on how it goes. When I'm on the road, it's a lot of treadmill work, although in the COVID era that has been more difficult, but starting to emerge from that, and so I'm doing a little bit more of that.
Great idea. Last summer, I started running for the first time probably in 20 or 30 years, and so I'm like a 2 or 3 mile kind of person. But
good for you. Keep it up.
It was a big change of life for me. Okay, your book is called Junk Science in the American Criminal Justice System. You dedicate the book to Keith Allen Harward, Stephen Mark Chaney, and Eddie Lee Howard. Let's talk about each of them kind of independently as we go through this, because they're kind of the core of, I think, hopefully the emotional pull of the book. So let's start with Keith Allen Harward. Who is he? How did he get caught up in the criminal justice system? And how did junk science get involved in his story?
So when Keith Harward's case came to us, because when at the Strategic Litigation Department, when we started to focus on forensic sciences, we decided that bite mark evidence, that the scientific community had weighed in on it as really the junkiest form of forensics that are still being used in the justice system today. And there had already been a number of wrongful convictions, when I first started there in 2012. And so what we decided to do is that we're going to litigate against the admissibility of the use of bite mark evidence, and that we were also going to search for, prisoners locked away around the nation on the use of this really grossly unreliable evidence. And so our paralegals, which spend a lot of time identifying potential casework and other, scientific research and everything that we're kind of looking for in terms of our advocacy, had read, one of my paralegals had read Keith Allen Harward's appellate opinion from the 80s that had affirmed his capital conviction for the rape and murder of, it was a rape of a young woman and the murder of her husband in 1984, I believe it was, is that in Newport News, Virginia, there was a young couple that was asleep in their bed. Their 3 young children were asleep down the hall. Somebody broke into their house in a Navy uniform and went upstairs to the couple's bedroom and bludgeoned to death the husband and sexually tortured the wife for 3 hours while the children were asleep down the hall. So it was a grotesque crime, obviously. The woman who survived, Teresa Perrone, never really got a good look at the sailor who had committed this atrocity. And there was no eyewitnesses. There was no forensic evidence to speak of. There were no fingerprints that were usable. And there was nobody that they had a particular, motive to do something like this. The only real evidence that they had was that it was a white person with a clean shaven, wearing a Navy uniform, around 5'10" or so. And that was all they had. But in Newport News at the time, and still today, is a huge Navy base. And the USS Carl Vinson was that's an aircraft carrier from the Navy, was dry docked there, and there were thousands, literally thousands of sailors and thousands of potential suspects. And because the Ted Bundy case had really brought bite mark evidence into the popular conscience only a few years before, and Teresa Perrone had said, and there were dozens of photographs documenting it, that the perpetrator had bitten her thighs. And so the only lead that and it wasn't really a lead, but they believed it to be a lead, was this bite mark evidence. And so what they did is they took the dental molds and radiographs of thousands of these Navy sailors that were stationed there at the time, and did this huge dental dragnet, and it attempted to, find the perpetrator by matching the teeth to the bite marks. And something like that, I don't think it had ever been tried before, and probably hasn't been tried since. And interestingly, Keith Harward was identified as a potential suspect in that his teeth were matched or attempted to match this bite mark, and he was excluded as a potential biter and therefore excluded as the potential perpetrator. So months went by, and there were no leads, and mounting political pressure from 2 U.S. senators and from the local media and from the local community to make an arrest. Increasingly desperate, the police were, going to great lengths. They were hypnotizing witnesses. A witness who had seen a sailor return to the Navy base in a blood-spattered uniform at night. They hypnotized him. They hypnotized Teresa Perone to try to get, better evidence. But memories can only be corrupted by they can't be improved over time, and certainly not with hypnotizing people. And so what happened was that Mr. Harward had gotten into a drunken dispute with his girlfriend at the time. She hit him with a frying pan. He bit her on the arm, and they both got arrested. And then Mr. Harward, who was in the Navy at the time and suddenly became a biter, and even though he wore a mustache, he basically fit the description. And then ultimately the two dentists that had excluded him as a biter changed their mind after this, world-renowned forensic odontologist, which is a fancy word for forensic dentist, named Lowell Levine, who had also testified in the Ted Bundy case, decided that Keith Harward and only Keith Harward could have made these bite marks to exclusion of everybody else. And that evidence was enough to overcome the lack of really any other evidence in the case. And and really, he would have been executed had his parents not got on the witness stand and begged for his life at the sentencing phase. And so, fast forward, 30 plus years, and, it just shows kind of how, our Innocence Project clients are 1 in a million. My paralegal came across the appellate opinion, and if you were skeptical about bite mark evidence, which of course we were, he sounded innocent. It's like, geez, that this is all they had, and like, what are the chances, and so we picked up his case, and, within a year and a half, the DNA had been discovered in the case. The actual perpetrator had been identified, and he was freed after 34 years of incarceration. 34
years. Wow.
Yeah.
I was particularly shocked by this quote in the book regarding bite marks. I believe it's from a case. There was no established science of identifying a person from bite marks. The technique had not been subject to even the most rudimentary tenets of the scientific method. No hypotheses were tested. No laboratory experiments were conducted. No clinical research. Would you talk a little bit about the history of the use of bite mark evidence in the courts and how this became something that's accepted despite the fact that there's literally no scientific basis for it?
Yeah, it's astonishing. And just to be clear, bite marks are not alone in this, but when I went back.
Oh, trust me, we're going to get to that.
I went back to kind of trace the origins of this particular technique, both in when I first started working on it as a litigator and also in research for this book. And you could see that what was happening is that in the 1960s and the 1970s, the legal system in our country just kind of grew exponentially. On the civil side, it was a result of personal injury litigation, mass tort litigation, product liability, and which became kind of a cottage industry. And on the criminal side, it was the mass incarceration and the drug war, which exploded the system. And so as a result, really had people that became expert witnesses as a career, as a profession. And in the criminal justice system, these were primarily forensic pathologists and FBI crime lab people that were becoming well-known in the criminal legal system and also in popular culture. Quincy was a very popular show about a forensic pathologist at this time.
I'm old enough to remember Quincy. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Right. And so these were crime solvers, and they were busting bad guys. And there was a lot of mythology built up around the forensic scientist as crime fighter. And so it was something that, a new career that you could actually aspire to be as a forensic scientist. And it was kind of exciting. And it was, part of the criminal justice system. And, there's always been a lot of fascination around that. And so forensic dentists, if you're familiar with, people being identified through their dental records, right? So sometimes you'll see a plane crash or something and somebody's burned beyond recognition and they're identified through their dental records. Most people aren't aware that that's your friendly neighborhood forensic dentist that works down at the medical examiner's office to identify John and Jane Does. But those folks were not getting into court. They weren't the Quincy's. They weren't making identifications. They weren't really part of that culture. They were kind of, derivative of it, but they were actually working in those labs. And so early in this field, you could see that the forensic odontologists were advocating for recognition of their contributions to the legal system and pointing to bite marks as something that had been overlooked as a potential crime-solving technique. And so what they did is they invented their own credentials. They invented a American Board of Forensic Odontology and started board certifying each other despite no tests to demonstrate you could actually match somebody into a bite mark or anything else other than the history of the field. And then they joined the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and they got their own section in the AAFS called the odontology section. And so they had all these credentials that were really built up around this idea of identifying bodies, which is basically legitimate stuff. But what they were working toward is getting a bite mark case into evidence and using this new technique to expand their fields. And these were not ill-intended folks. These people were recognizing that there was no science, but believed that there was something to be said, in this field. And when they finally found like the perfect test case, what they got is a bite mark that was created on somebody's nose, right? So this murder victim had her nose nearly bitten off, and it was in cartilage, which doesn't have the same problems as skin in terms of, recording a bite mark, which changes every minute as the body decomposes, or the living victim as the wound heals. So you can match 1 minute and not match the next. So that fundamental problem was never even explored in the legal system. But what they did is that they conflated these two subdisciplines of this field, victim identification, so the idea that you identify people by their teeth, and then this opposite side of the same coin, at least as it was presented, is that we also identify people by the bite marks those teeth create. And so it makes sense on kind of a superficial level, but if you actually think about it, it's more like a geologist claiming that because they can identify a rock, that they're capable of identifying the rock that was used to bash in somebody's head, right? So totally unrelated fields, but they could make it sound like they were one and credible. And they already had all these credentials in terms of, were board certified forensic odontologists. So they got in this court, the Marks case, the first case that introduced this evidence, and it spread like a virus throughout the criminal legal system. And the reasoning that the court, as you pointed out, first used was saying that, well, there's no science here. There's not been any research done. We know all of this, but this stuff is so elemental that we don't even really need to scrutinize it the way we would, whiz-bang technology or something that would be likely to confuse a juror, because a juror can see with their own eyes whether or not, there's a match in this particular case or not. And so that reasoning was used not just for bite marks, but for all these pattern matching techniques, hair microscopy and tire treads and shoe prints and, all the other pattern matching techniques to kind of shield these techniques from typical scrutiny in the courts.
It's interesting you bring up the tire treads, because the example of this that came to mind when I was reading the book was My Cousin Vinny, when they're talking about the tire treads.
Right.
So, I think everybody who's seen that movie, at least, that is part of what we're talking about here, right? This whole notion, this eyeball test, this idea that people just through their experience can look at things and make a conclusion. Is that basically the argument?
Yeah, well, I mean, eyeballing evidence in science is never the way that you would be, measurement is the basis of most science, right? You measure something, to come to a conclusion. And many of these pattern-matching techniques is simply eyeballing it and using your judgment and subjective judgment to come to that conclusion. The My Cousin Vinny example, I think that car had posi traction, which was something that might have made a difference in the way that a skid mark would be laid down. That's a little bit different. So I don't know enough about it to know that particular depiction was junk science, but generally speaking, as far as pattern matching goes, for sure, and one of the real problems with this, and we see this with the Keith Harward case, and we see this in many other examples I explore in the book, is that these are subjective judgments, right? And so subjective judgments are susceptible to bias, and that's just the way the human mind works. This is something that we can't will away, the National Academy of Sciences has said that, and every other mainstream science has taken efforts to mitigate the influence of bias. And one of the most stark examples, apart from the dentist changing their minds in Keith Harward's case and saying, "Oh, we do think he matches. Never mind," right? After he was identified as a suspect, but when they were doing it blindly, he was excluded, right? And then this is not just bite marks, though. If you think about fingerprints, there was a very well-known Brandon Mayfield, who was wrongfully identified through a fingerprint match as the person responsible for the commuter bombing of the commuter train in Madrid, Spain in 2004. And Brandon Mayfield happened to be Muslim and happened to have represented somebody who had been convicted of providing material aid to a terrorist organization, but he had never been to Spain. But the FBI was positive that it was him because he kind of fit the profile, and then that evidence had been validated by two other, allegedly independently by fingerprint experts, until the Spanish authorities actually matched it to what is still today believed the actual perpetrator. And this was, a shock around because it was fingerprints, that there had been this really high-profile misidentification, and a look at what were the subjective factors that led to these other experts who kept confirming the wrong match. And the idea is that we're influenced by factors that are irrelevant to the actual looking at the evidence. Does this evidence match this evidence, right? Rather than all the other information about a case that will point you in one direction or another to conclude whether or not there's a match. Right. And so what ETL Drawer did after that case is a very clever experiment. And he sent the casework to 5 different really well-qualified latent fingerprint experts of latent fingerprints from crime scenes and exemplars of potential matches. But what he didn't tell these experts was that the evidence was from their own prior casework. In other words, they had already come to conclusions around the match or the not match on these particular sets of exemplars. The only thing he changed was the contextual information, right? So that pointed one way or another, right? There was an identification in this, or that there was confession or something like that. And 3/5 of them changed their minds from their original conclusion, and nothing had changed about the evidence, only the contextual information. We see that in Keith Harward's case, we see that in Stephen Chaney's case, and we see that in forensics. And still today, there is no real effort to mitigate the influence and the well-documented influence of cognitive bias. And one of the things that the Innocence Project has advocated for a long time is the separation of crime labs from law enforcement. And it's for this reason, because if you have, forensic experts that have a mindset of catching bad guys and solving crimes, you're going to get that type of influence. And it's particularly problematic in pattern matching techniques because no measurements are taken. There's no objectivity in the conclusions that are being offered.
And of course, the problem is also that it creates kind of a negative incentive. Once the type of evidence is accepted, as you said in the book, there's really no incentive to conduct research or test the ability of the putative experts. Why, I think you put it, why conduct research on a technique that's already been accepted in court? Why indeed? This is a problem, right?
Right, because that's, most forensic techniques, unlike DNA, which is, of course, the exception to most of what we're talking about, is that they don't really have applications outside of the criminal legal system, right? So if you're, you don't need a ballistics expert in everyday life. Its only use is in criminal court. So if it's already being accepted and the most extravagant claims are accepted in criminal court, why risk doing research that might undermine, this previously accepted, claims that have been accepted for a century, right? Even though today, we know, as, the National Academy of Sciences has pointed out, and many other forensic or mainstream scientific organizations have pointed out, that the claims that, one bullet was fired by one gun to the exclusion of every other gun manufactured in the history of time is scientifically indefensible, right? But it's still being accepted today. So if you're going to do research that tended to undermine that, why would you do that? It's very disruptive.
Okay, so the second story in the book is Stephen Mark Chaney. How did he get caught up in the criminal justice system, and how did junk science get involved in his story?
Yeah, Stephen Chaney was my first Innocence Project client. We took on his case because there was a number of conditions that we thought were important to test in Texas in particular, because there was a new, what became known as a junk science writ, and that was an amendment to their habeas corpus statute that allowed prisoners that had been convicted on alleged scientific evidence to go back to court if they can demonstrate that the progress of science had undermined the testimony at trial. There was a new conviction integrity unit that was important that we could talk to about the use of the evidence in his case. And there was the Texas Forensic Science Commission, which was willing to do independent investigations of forensic techniques. And so we were looking for bite mark cases, and I got an email from Julie Lesser, who had recently picked up Stephen Chaney's case, and said that at his trial, that forensic dentist had testified that there was a 1 in a million chance that anybody other than Stephen Chaney had left this bite mark on one of the murder victims. And, that was obviously preposterous testimony, and immediately became very interested in taking a deeper look at his case. So what we learned was that, in the early 80s in Dallas, which was a very heavy cocaine scene at that time, and there was a young married couple.
I may actually have lived in Dallas in the in the early 80s, so...
Right, and MDMA was legal at that time, right?
It absolutely was. You could get it in bars at the bar.
Right, yeah. So it was a very different scene at that time, and it was still an era where cocaine was not considered addictive. It was just a different era, obviously. And
not that I would know from any experience or anything.
Yes, I'm certainly not pointing any fingers at you, but or anybody else.
Allegedly.
Right. And so this young couple was dealing cocaine out of their apartment, and they had gotten in trouble with their drug suppliers before and had to flee for their lives, a couple of years before this incident. And it's hard to call it an incident, but they had apparently run into trouble with their suppliers again. And then one night, their bodies were found in the kitchen, and they've both been brutally murdered. Both have been stabbed at least 18, 20 times each. And it was really just a bloodbath in this kitchen. And they were discovered by friends and customers of John and Sally Sweek. And so there was, an incalculable number of suspects. If you're in the drug trade, you're going to, make enemies, and it's hard to really nail down who might want to kill you. But what it appeared to, from the basic facts, was that this was somebody that was executed and in a way that was meant to send a message to anybody that, out there, that this is what happens to people that fall behind on their drug debts. But the police had no real evidence. They had no eyewitnesses. They had, 60, 70 different latent fingerprints that were all, most of them were bloody, but they didn't have any, potential matches to anybody. And, they really had no evidence other than they identified this person initially that was a drug supplier and had come looking for John and Sally Sweek, days before that they were murdered. But there was no fingerprint match to him. And then, and somehow, they just kind of let him go. And then about a week after the homicide, a so-called friend of Stephen Cheney's had contacted the police and claimed that Mr. Cheney had a motive to murder both of these people because he owed them money, a drug debt of $500, which he thought was motive enough to murder them both, even though Stephen Cheney had never been accused of any violent crime, had 2 misdemeanor marijuana arrests on his record. He was 30 years old. He was supporting 2 kids. He was an iron worker at the time. And he presented 9 alibi witnesses at trial. But what happened is that once he was identified as a suspect, you could see he became a bullseye, and they started painting a target around him. And so there was a shoe print evidence that was said that his shoe could not be excluded as one of the bloody footprints in the footwear evidence in the kitchen where the murders had occurred. They claimed that a presumptive drug test had shown that there was blood on his sneakers. His fingerprint was found near the bodies, but he had spent a lot of time at this week's apartment because he was somebody that was buying cocaine from him at the time, as if he used cocaine. And so and that fingerprint was not bloody, unlike so many of the others. And then there was this injury on John Sweek's forearm, this U-shaped injury. And there's a photograph of it in my book. So it'd be, I invite readers to take a look at it, and see if it looks like a bite mark to you, because it doesn't to me. But they decided that this injury was a bite mark. And then that was all they decided. And they decided that it had been inflicted 2 to 3 days before this murder, right? So really not even that relevant to, who might have actually committed this, horrible crime. But once Stephen Cheney was identified as the suspect, the dentist, Jim Hales, at the time, who was a chief forensic odontologist for the Dallas Medical Examiner's Office, he decided that Stephen Cheney's teeth were consistent with having made this bite mark. He couldn't say at that time that he was the only person in the world who could have made this bite mark, but it was consistent with. And then we see how this opinion evolved over time. And you see this in a lot of wrongful conviction cases. And you see, a lot of cases, period, is that as the case gets closer and closer to trial, more and more pressure is put on the forensic expert to have more conclusive opinions, to have more damaging evidence to present at trial, and often are persuaded that this defendant is guilty, and that they're helping put away a bad guy. And you see the evolution, and I document this evolution in the book about how a bite mark was at one time consistent with, became Stephen Cheney, and then at trial it became 1 in a million that anybody other than Stephen Cheney had committed, had created this bite mark. And then the time changed from 2 or 3 days before the trial to at or near the time of trial, and that evidence was enough, plus this other kind of throw-in junk science that was used, a polygraph and a shoe print and the presumptive drug test, to overcome 9 alibi witnesses, including, a woman, Lenora Cheney, who became his wife and was one of his alibi witnesses and stuck with him for the next 30 years that he spent in prison, just as a result purely of junk science.
Yeah, and I mean, it's amazing to me that you've got a situation where a guy's got 9 alibi witnesses, and then you've got this bite mark that supposedly happened before the crime was committed, and somehow that becomes a 1 in a million proof to the jury that this person's the only person who could have committed the crime. You really couldn't write anything more terrifying and upsetting in a lot of ways. We've talked a lot about kind of forensic testimony related to bites, but later in the book, you take a detour into arson investigations, and a prosecutor saying about criminal trials, the defendant has 2 strikes against him the minute the jury is sworn in. Proving a case beyond a reasonable doubt sounds like a high bar, but jurors tend to believe what prosecutors tell them. It's an interesting statement, kind of giving the mythology. I think most people believe there's a certain truth to our system. You've been in and around a lot of trials. How would you unpack this kind of reality of presumed guilty versus kind of the notion of presumed innocent?
Most people that are indicted and tried for a crime are guilty at least of some of the factual allegations against them, right? And imagine a society we lived in where that wasn't true. But and we talked earlier today, though, this percentage of folks that are likely innocent, are tens of thousands of people, given the volume of what our justice system looks like today in this country. So the idea that somebody is presumed innocent, when they're on trial is really not true. And that the idea is that most people, the judge, the prosecutor, the jurors, the gallery, everybody but the defendant and the defense attorney are presuming that this person did something, that they weren't picked out of a phone book, and that really the trial is about proving, that guilt. And that's a reality, and I talk a little bit about that in the context of the arson detour that you called it in the book, is that one of the original arson prosecutions that began to unravel the mythology that had been used to wrongfully execute Cameron Todd Willingham, which is a case that I talk about in the book.
I actually remember the story about him in the Texas Monthly when I was living in Texas around that time. So yeah.
Right. And so that, what's astonishing is that once the arson mythology had been debunked, is that the number of reported arson cases in this country reduced by nearly 40%, right? And so the idea wasn't that people were, deliberately setting fewer fires, is that there were fewer being called arson because they recognized that this was not good evidence of arson. And what the prosecutor in the case that I talk about, the Gerald Lewis case, was really the first controlled experiment that had been ever done in arson investigation, was done in the context of a capital case in Florida. And John Lentini, who's one of the characters in the book, was hired by the prosecution in that because the defense had presented in that case a fair amount of evidence of innocence, even though there was a lot of circumstantial evidence that pointed to guilt in that case. And the prosecutor, who ultimately was, I quoted in that, saying that, he understood that the defendant has 2 strikes against him when he's starting. And this was a capital prosecution, and there were 6 dead people in this case. So it was a very, very serious case. And what was, to his great credit, he did not railroad the case forward, even though all the traditional arson indicators that were thought to be arson indicators at the time pointed toward a deliberate fire. And what John Lentini had suggested, and what this prosecutor actually did, was the first controlled experiment that was, what they did is the house that was next door to what they thought was a crime scene was nearly identical. And they recreated all the conditions of the crime scene house before it burned down in the house next door, and they burned down the house in an experiment to show whether or not these signs that they had looked at, like something like alligatoring on the floor and pour patterns on the ground that looked as though somebody had used a liquid accelerant like gasoline to light this fire, and things that they believed indicated multiple points of origin. In other words, that somebody had set a fire in a number of places in the house, which would suggest, of course, that was a deliberate fire. All these things that have been used to prosecute other people, that have been used to put Cameron Todd Willingham to death, were part of the underlying basis of the capital indictment against Gerald Lewis. So when they conducted this experiment, all these telltale signs they knew had not been a fire that had been used, that had been deliberately set using an experiment. They saw the same indicators. Multiple points of origin in a fire that only had one origin, right? The alligatoring on the floor, even though there was no accelerant used. Pour patterns, or something that looked like pour patterns that weren't pour patterns. And ultimately, that prosecutor dismissed the indictment, which, was, a remarkable and an unusual prosecution, and saved a life during that. And really, how many more lives were potentially saved as a result of a scientific experiment that could have been done at any time and never was. And that's really what the Innocence Project has been advocating for a long time, is that we have to have something like the FDA that tests toothpaste, aspirin, toilet paper for, anything that is going to be used by American consumers for public safety reasons, right? We don't have anything like that in forensic sciences. We don't have an agency that is doing the scientific validation research outside the context of a criminal prosecution, where there aren't the pressures that we've been talking about to validate some of these claims that are being made routinely in criminal court, and that it get tied up in the adversarial system, which is a terrible place to try to decide what's valid science and what isn't. And so I used that, a couple of those cases, including Nancy Grace's final case.
That was pretty disturbing too. Yeah,
right? Yeah. To kind of demonstrate, here's where we could be, and here's where we aren't. And that's like what I think is really central to the arson discussion. It's just how radically it was changed as a result of one scientific experiment.
So we have kind of a presumption against the defendant. We have kind of this massive array of state forces on one side trying to make sure someone gets convicted. We kind of have a presumption that people are afforded good counsel, but I think even when you have good counsel, I think you mentioned in the book that at one point you were handling hundreds of cases at a time. And I know I partially got into being an activist, not just because I'd been incarcerated, but because I remember standing outside of a courtroom and seeing that many public defenders were doing 30 cases, and it looked like in a day on the docket. And I was like, how can that work? And so we have all these things. And then there's also this principle of finality, which is really, I think we've come across this a couple times on the podcast, but it's something that just blows my mind. Can you talk about this principle and why it's so problematic?
Yeah, it's the principle of finality essentially means that once a jury comes back with a guilty verdict, the idea is that that's the truth, that's the case. You get one appeal, and then that's it, and then there's no going back and taking a second look, even though we use science all the time in criminal trials, and then science is a process that is always moving forward, and the criminal legal system is based on legal precedent that doesn't really move forward. The principle of finality had been used to justify sawing off avenues of post-conviction relief for a long, long time. And what was so disruptive about the advent of forensic DNA evidence and the establishment of the Innocence Project was really the challenge to this bedrock principle of our justice system, is that the jury verdicts are the last word. Because, and this is really the result of the intake criteria that the Innocence Project initially had. And it had been for 20 years, 30 years, is that there wasn't going to be a subjective evaluation of the quantum of evidence against people that wrote in for our help. In other words, we weren't counting how many eyewitnesses there were, if there was a confession and there was other evidence. We were taking cases that had 6 eyewitnesses, that somebody had confessed in great detail to the crime. The only criteria was if biological evidence can be found and tested, and that came back in a way that excluded the defendant, would that prove innocence? That was the only criteria. And what that resulted in was the discovery of how unreliable eyewitness identification actually is, and how unreliable so many of these forensic techniques that have been used and thought to be infallible were, that people actually falsely confessed to crimes that they didn't commit. None of that was thought to be even a thing at the time, right? And that the justice system, with notable exceptions, was essentially infallible. And so you had these forces that came together, which is science that was overruling, that the justice system's principle of finality. And then you had the buildup of the carceral state, as a result of the drug war, and then sawing off of avenues of post-conviction relief by the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which effectively excluded federal courts from reviewing state court convictions where the overwhelming majority of violent crimes are prosecuted and where the overwhelming majority of wrongful convictions occur. And so the principle of finality is used to justify it still today by prosecutors and by courts to deny the post-conviction relief, in that and some of the case law that's been built up around this that points to that has accepted crazy post-conviction theories by prosecutors to explain away exculpatory DNA evidence or to deny compelling evidence of innocence on procedural grounds, right? And so technicalities that won't actually get to whether or not this person was guilty or innocent. Has there been a miscarriage of justice? Has there been an unfair trial? You know,
it seems like there's also another perverse incentive. You mentioned one prosecutor's office in the book that made it an office policy to dispose of all evidence after a conviction, which then makes it impossible to test the DNA because there's no DNA, no biological evidence to test. It seems like, you know, they've created a perfect loop in a sense.
Yeah, that was the Claude Jones case in Texas. Is one of the 4 cases that I argue are wrongful executions, all committed in Texas. And what happened with his case?
What a shocker! It's in Texas. I mean,
right?
I think that wasn't it, Abbott just presided over his 55th execution just last week, I believe.
Yes, and as we are sitting here today, you know, Melissa Lucio's scheduled for execution next week. You know, so you know, and there are grave doubts about her guilt in this case, and it's also again in Texas, and it's Abbott who's again going to have to make that decision. And what you go back to the Claude Jones case, in that, you know, Claude Jones was somebody that was, you know, a quote unquote career criminal and was not a very high profile case. It was a robbery that turned into a homicide of a liquor store. But the only physical evidence that was in the case was a hair microscopy match. And that put him inside the liquor store and therefore the trigger man in that case, and that made him eligible for the death penalty because the only other evidence against him was, you know, alleged co-conspirator testimony or snitch testimony. Then the other 2 people that were allegedly involved in this both are free today. You know, I mean, although I think one may actually still be in, but the one of the other people that pointed the finger at Claude Jones is free. And what the Innocence Project had done and advocated for was, after it became known that hair microscopy was so unreliable, and they were looking at this execution that was based, you know, primarily on hair microscopy, they actually went and found the hair that was used to place Claude Jones in the liquor store, and to manage to convince one court, after many, many courts had denied it, pointing to the principle of finality as a block, you know, as a reason not to know the truth. And, you know, courageously, one judge actually ordered the DNA testing to be done. And it showed, in fact, that it was not Claude Jones' hair that had placed him at the crime scene. You know, I mean, and before that, the prosecutor was, to avoid knowing whether an innocent person had been executed, pointed to the principle of finality, saying that the jury's verdict should be final. And to me, that's just astonishing that we're so afraid of the truth.
Just blows my mind. Okay, so the third major character in the book is Eddie Lee Howard. This one actually upset me quite a bit. How did he get up in the criminal justice get caught up in the criminal justice system? How did junk science get involved in his story?
You know, Eddie Lee Howard's case is really about structural racism and less about junk science. And I talk, you know, a number of cases in the book about Black men that were accused of violating white women, and that, you know, this plays on racist tropes that have led to lynchings and wrongful executions for the last, you know, hundreds of years. And what happened with Eddie Lee Howard's case was that an elderly white woman was raped and murdered, and the perpetrator appeared to have attempted to burn down her house to hide evidence of the crime. No witnesses, no forensic evidence, really nothing to point to any particular perpetrator. This person had no known enemies. And so what the police did in Mississippi, and this was in Columbus, Mississippi, a small town in the middle of the state, and had basically started rounding up Black people as potential suspects on this crime. And that was really what they were going with, you know, kind of, you know, the quote unquote usual suspects. And, you know, Eddie Lee Howard was identified as one of these people, but they had no real evidence against him. But they decided that, you know, he was good for it, or at least good enough. But the problem is that the victim had already been autopsied and had all of her organs removed and her brain removed, and she was buried unembalmed in the ground for 4 days before he was identified as a potential suspect. What was astonishing is at the same time that they decided that Eddie Lee Howard was a suspect, they took him straight to the dentist to get a mold of his teeth taken. And then they ordered the body to be disinterred, even though there was no evidence at autopsy. And we have photographs and documentation showing that there were no evidence of bite marks anywhere on the body. But they decided get this dental mold and disinter this body, or the remains of this body, and see if you can find a bite mark and match it to Eddie Lee Howard. And this is what you have when you have, this type of junk science is already admissible. We know that we can almost interpret any kind of injury as a bite mark. And we've got the perfect expert to do it, the notorious Dr. Michael West, who is one of the most notorious forensic experts in the annals of forensic sciences in this country. And he'd already been totally discredited by the time this case came along. But what he did was he got out his black magic, lights and the so-called West phenomenon, and he used ultraviolet lights to discover bite marks that were totally undocumented before. And he matched 3 of these bite marks to Eddie Lee Howard to exclusion of everybody else on the planet. And that was enough to send Eddie Lee Howard to death row in Parchman Prison Farm in Mississippi, one of the most notorious prisons in the world. And it was just on Dr. West's say-so. They didn't even have any photographs of the alleged injuries at trial. There were no dental molds. There was no demonstrative evidence at all. It was just somebody who was claiming to be an expert, claiming that there were bite marks on his body, and claiming that Eddie Lee Howard matched them. And that was enough for the conviction. And what that shows, in addition to the racism that underlies the entire prosecution, and to be clear, the entire criminal legal system, but that just the idea of forensic sciences was enough to convict, right? And enough that this person was declared an expert witness. He was a board certified member of the American Board of Forensic Odontology, and he had all these credentials that suggested he was, a credible witness when he had zero credibility. And, it was a monumental struggle to get him off death row, and one of one of the things that occurs to me a lot in this type of litigation is that when we have non-capital cases and we're working on people's cases who aren't sentenced to death, is that I'm not sure if Eddie Lee Howard ever gets out of prison if he hadn't been sentenced to death, because you have to take it more seriously than somebody who's just thrown away for the rest of their lives. If somebody gets life without parole, those cases don't get the kind of attention and lawyering that a death row case will, and that to me is chilling. And it makes me, when we're talking about how many potentially wrongfully convicted people there are in this country, you think about the life without parole cases where you don't get teams of really good lawyers and a lot of people that are digging into the case in ways that it had never been dug in before. For example, in the Eddie Lee Howard case, the fact that the victim had been, the body had been totally mutilated during the autopsy and buried unembalmed, and that there was no evidence of bite marks before the autopsy, West was not even cross-examined about that at trial at all. The first time that anybody had asked him about that was when I was doing the deposition that I write about in the book, which is this crazy deposition where he's calling me an asswipe.
It is a crazy deposition. It's
like a madman that had been put on, the witness stand that put this, person on death row. So it's in some ways it's funny if it wasn't so serious, but it was I worry and think about a lot, life without parole on these wrongful convictions and how hard it is to, get the kind of teams of lawyers that you need to really do quality post-conviction investigation work, and what it really takes to overcome the principle of finality. And, the Innocence Project is is certainly compared to the scale of the justice system, a tiny organization, right? You can't rely on a handful of lawyers that, I work with and that work in the Innocence Network, around the country to free the innocent. It's just not enough. We have to have better upstream fixes.
I think you mentioned throughout the book, it might be a non-exhaustive list, but hair and fiber, ballistics, prints, tire treads, arson investigations, blood splatter evidence, handwriting, even fingerprint evidence. But all of these are still pretty much admissible. And I think if you asked most people in the country, most would consider them valid. I think probably because of shows like CSI and the ones you mentioned before, Quincy, stuff like that. Does the media bear any responsibility for kind of the continuation of this kind of behemoth of junk science?
Oh my God, yes. You know what I mean? What I'm trying to do with the book is create a new genre of like not true crime, right? You know what I mean? It's
Not
like,
true crime. I like that.
that's what we need. Is it, you know, like the example that I like to point to when you talk about, you know, the CSI effect, you know what I mean, is that, you know, we have two cases that we're currently, well, one that we're still litigating, one we're not, that we became aware of as a result of watching the forensic files. And that if you were like the lawyers in my department looking at this seemed like this person sounds innocent. You know, this is being depicted as, look at this whiz bang technology that was used to catch the bad guy. One of those cases is Jimmy Genrick in Colorado, which we just did the evidentiary hearing. It's a case that's talked about a little bit in the book, which is a series of bombings in Colorado in the 80s and 90s that the only physical evidence, and really the only evidence in the case is like that a little scratch mark on a detonated bomb was made by Jimmy Genrick's wire stripper to solution every other wire stripper ever manufactured in the history of time. And that's the only evidence, scientifically indefensible opinion that was offered at trial. And then another case, Alfred Swinton in Connecticut, where he was thought to be a serial killer. And they tried to put 8 bodies on him. But he was only convicted on one of those murders because a series of murders of prostitutes in Connecticut had been going on for some time during that era. And Alfred Swinton was identified as a suspect. In one of the cases, there was an alleged bite mark on the victim's breast. And that was depicted as definitive evidence both at trial and on the forensic files. And then when we saw it, we picked up his case. About 16 months later, he was exonerated and freed. He's innocent. He'd never been convicted of any other crimes. And, you know, still years later, you could still watch it on YouTube as that this was definitive evidence of Alfred Swinton's guilt. You know, I wrote to Bill Curtis at the time, you know, was the host of the show. I was like, hey, you know, he's innocent. How about we take that down? You know what I mean? And we see this in show after. There's a CSI episode that shows bite mark evidence as, you know, definitive evidence of guilt. And there's, back in the day, there's a Columbo episode showing bite mark evidence. You know what I mean? It's like, it contributes to mythology that's built up around forensics that they're essentially infallible. And, you know, given the 2 strikes that defendants have when they walk into court to begin with, any kind of forensic science evidence like that is going to be enough to convict almost anybody of almost anything.
So we talked about how the book, in a way, is a story of 3 people that you dedicated the book to. The end of your book rightfully celebrates the exoneration of these men, one of whom had to actually wear leg irons for years despite being innocent. But to me, it still kind of felt very sad. I felt sad for the men who'd lost most of their lives. I felt sad for us as a society for continuing to invest more in the certainty of punishment than in actual justice. Where did finishing the book leave you in terms of your feelings about going through all this and what had happened?
You know, I work hard to not be too cynical about my work, you know what I mean? And so what fuels me to go to the office every day is my outrage at some of the things that have happened to our clients, you know what I mean? And this goes back to my time as a public defender. It goes back to my mother's drug rest, you know, in the 60s, that, you can't spend time, and, you know, I think you ask any public defender this, you know, like standing next to people who have been traumatized by, you know, systemic racism in this country time and time again. And this is just an extension of that. And not have a sense of deep injustice about what's happening every day in criminal courts around the country. And it's not just the searing injustices that I write about, but it's the day in, day out, you know, where people have to plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit because they can't make bail, or presumptive drug tests that are used to claim that somebody had drugs when they didn't have drugs, or people that are arrested for low-level misdemeanors and can't fight those cases from the inside and have to take a plea to get out. And you know, that happens. And that was, you know, I read a little bit about this in the book about my time as a public defender and with the Bronx Defenders in the South Bronx, where, you know, my first arraignment shift, I at least 5, 6 people had been arrested and spent nights, sometimes 2 or 3 nights in jail, entirely innocent of any crime at all. And that was mind blowing to me, and
especially given Rikers, right? Like it's a pretty
Rikers is, a day in Rikers, it's a life altering experience, And so, I think it's important to point out that as incredible as the stories that I write about are, the day in, day out injustices are in many ways, equal and life altering. And, and that's what makes me go to work every day. And no, it's not, I didn't feel happy, and I wish that I could give the story a happy ending, but I mean,
it kind of is a happy ending. I don't mean to make it sound like it's not a happy ending, but there is some sadness there. Right? Some pretty profound, for me at least.
These are great losses. It's, I mean, it's, just imagine just having like most of your life just wiped out, and spending that, in prison, is really, and what a lot of people at the Innocence Project will point to as the astonishing grace that so many of our clients demonstrate when they're out, and the lack of bitterness and, the savoring of freedom, is really astonishing, and those moments I feel fuel a lot of the work that we do. Then, what is less talked about, but it's also equally true, is the post-traumatic stress that our clients have experienced, and the lingering effects of, grave injustice like that are really hard to undo. And, and that's why, the failure to adequately compensate the wrongfully convicted is such an outrage that is still a persistent problem in this country. And the denial of innocence of so many people that haven't been able to conclusively demonstrate their innocence, but every sign points to this. And sometimes they'll be coerced into pleading guilty just to get out of prison when evidence has been, plainly establishes their innocence. So there are a lot of, progress is being made by organizations like ours, and, kind of the slow understanding of the costs of mass incarceration, but it's certainly not being done fast enough. And if you look at, we have the highest incarceration rate in the world in the United States, and we have amongst the most highest rates of violent crime. So clearly, mass incarceration is not working at reducing crime, right?
I make this point all the time. I'm always saying, look, if traditional policing is the answer, we spend $120 billion on police every year in this country. If incarceration is the answer, we spend $80 billion a year on incarceration in this country. If these are the answers, why is there still such a problem? They point to like small reforms we've passed, but is that really enough to disrupt this gigantic enterprise that's been created?
Apparently not.
It's mind-boggling to me. So my friend Amanda Alexander always talks about the power of dreaming big and of having freedom dreams. This season, I'm asking folks what dreams they have about changing our system. You've mentioned a couple of the things that you all have been hoping for. Is there anything else you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, apart from what I've already said, is that we need to end the drug war today, and that we need to stop treating a public health crisis as a criminal problem and address the public health issues that underlie it. And, we have to stop using junk science.
Amen. I also like to ask people if there are any criminal justice related books that they like and might recommend to our listeners. Do you have any favorite books?
I have many favorite books.
As you can see, I read a lot. It's fun.
I mean, Just Mercy is a fantastic book.
It's right over there. Yeah.
An American Marriage is not often pointed to as a criminal justice book, but it is, and it's a wonderful read, and really one of the most moving books I've read. So those two, I think, are I don't think you can do better than those two.
I always ask this. How would you recommend people find your book? Do you have any particular place you'd like for people to look more than others, or?
I would love it if they look for the book. Period.
Just period. Okay. I always ask the same last question. What did I mess up? What question should I have asked but did not?
No, I think that you've asked a lot of good questions. I've appreciated the interview, and I appreciate the advocacy work that you've been doing.
Thanks so much. I always like to hear that I didn't mess up, but I'm always willing to listen to what I missed. Thanks so much for doing this. It was a real pleasure to talk to you. And really, I get lucky in that I get to read a lot of books, and they're almost all pretty good books, but I found this to be a really powerful read. So hopefully everybody will give it a read.
Thank you so much, Josh. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for listening to the Decarceration Nation podcast. You can learn more about this episode in the notes or visit our website, www.decarcerationnation.com. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe and please like this episode and leave comments below. Special thanks to Andrew Stein, who does the editing and post-production for me, to Ann Espo for helping with our transcripts and social media images, and to Alex Mayo, who helps with our website and does the video transcription. Make sure and add us on social media and share our posts across your network. Also, thanks to my employer, Safe and Just Michigan, for helping to support the Decarceration Nation podcast. Thanks so much for listening to the Decarceration Nation podcast. See you next time.